I like this. Comfort and optimism with the impending leadership change. That's so key. So I talked about meeting with staff. If it means meeting with staff more than once, if it means meeting with staff in small groups,
Yeah.
I think that's critical. I would do that. I would have, doesn't have to just be the consultant. Maybe board members can come in and meet with the staff and talk about how engaged they are, what's happening. Really, the face-to-face makes a very big difference in people's comfort level.
Yeah.
Board members knowing who the staff are. It's a great time if they haven't, if they've been shielded. This is a great time for board to be more engaged, for staff to say, oh, the board really is watching out for us.
Yeah.
They really care.
And for the fundraising staff, that's critical because they know how important the board is to their job, even if it's annual fund letters. There might be a board member name on it, or they have input on those kinds of things. I mean, so we're not just talking about the major donor types or the people who work just with major donors. We're talking about people at all levels of the fundraising staff. I mean, in some respects, even the gifts processor who is far away from the board member needs to understand that life is going to be secure.
Everybody in the organization, the front desk people, the people who work in the back rooms, everybody should be engaged in this process. So I would make sure that whoever's leading this keeps the pulse on the organization. Sometimes a leadership transition can be really fast. I can't imagine happening in less than 6 months, but it could go on as long as a year. That's a lot of time for people to create anxiety. People handle uncertainty differently. Some people find uncertainty exciting, change is exciting, it's new beginnings, and some people find uncertainty very scary. So you need to balance out the people who are positive about the change with the people who are really quite nervous. And it may affect their work, it may affect their commitment to the organization.
Well, in fact, the people who find it scary, this might be a good way of engaging them to maintain the stability of the organization, because they don't want things to change so much, so you can rely on them and approach them to say, listen, this is going to be hard, but you are one of the rocks here that can move
I like
forward.
that, Matt. That's great. Yeah.
Well, because I'm thinking actually of a particular staff person I worked with early in my career who really filled that role. And in retrospect, it was essential. But I know for a fact, and I could cite some examples of how terrified she was of change.
Absolutely.
She had grown up in a very unstable environment as being somebody who was a child during World War II, who knew what change was and was all about having things being stable. And so I knew we could rely on her to kind of keep things going while we had a lot of transition going on around her.
Yeah, so this means that you really need to be very thoughtful about who your staff is and what they need. So everybody doesn't get a broad brush.
Yeah.
Really, I think that's why I think leadership change is an exciting time, because you have to really revisit the organization and think about how people are engaged, what they're going to need, who needs a lot of hand holding, who's going to be able to ride with this, and give people roles that are appropriate for them. But make sure, again, I know I've said this before, that everybody's engaged and has a sense of optimism, because the ship is being guided. It's not a rudderless ship. It's a ship where people are steering it. It has a direction. It will have an outcome, and everybody will have a role to play.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference when people feel engaged that way.
Absolutely. And it's really made a difference. And again, it's a possibility. Matt said it. I want to say it again. You might lose some key donors or some key stakeholders in the process, but you will do your best to keep everybody.
Yeah.
Change is not easy. You will do your best to keep all the staff, but it might be an opportunity to think about staff that aren't a fit, about board members that aren't a fit.
Well, and I might be getting ahead of you here, but I know the other issue that you face in fundraising is when donors don't want to come on board until the transition is done.
Aha.
Yeah.
Count me out?
Yeah, well, right. It's like, well, we're going to wait until you get your new leader. And then, and I think particularly a foundation, but even a major donors, that they need to see the final direction because they know, they're bright people, they know that things are going to change one way or another, and a new leader might take the organization in a different way.
That's an interesting point. So I want to say that I know, so foundations, let's use them as an example.
Sure.
Have different views of leadership change. And I
Yep.
know that some of the very large foundations used to step back and not give any new funding while
Right.
a leadership change was happening.
Mhm.
Whereas other foundations will support it and often might provide grants for the process to keep everyone engaged. They're starting to look at it differently.
Mhm.
But the most important thing, again, is engaging them so they know what the organization's doing. You can't tell them the outcome, but you can tell them the process.
Well, and this is something that I get into. So some of you might know, listening to this, that I teach a class on grant proposal writing, is that these people who are, particularly the more professional foundations and grant giving organizations, they have jobs. They're judged on the results of what they're doing. So being cautious is in their DNA, not just as an organization, but in them personally, because if their boss comes back to them and says, well, that one failed, how come? They're going to have a conversation there that may not be comfortable with them. So again, back to engaging them, talking to them, letting them know what's happening, giving them the confidence that this is a process, not just a roll of the dice, is huge.
Yes. So one of the questions I ask when I'm guiding a leadership transition is I ask to be connected to all their main stakeholders and their main donors. And they're always surprised that I ask that. And what I want to do is I'm talking about major stakeholders. I want to have a conversation with them and say, what's your vision of the organization? And it matters to me less what their vision is and more that they've been asked the question.
Yes.
So they feel that they've been engaged in the process. And once they've been engaged in the process, the likelihood that they're going to continue to fund is much greater.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it does. That
so the biggest foundation I will call their program officers, not the head of the foundation, but all the program officers. I will ask the organization if they don't want me to talk to their major donors. I will ask for them to complete a leadership assessment so they can have their input in. And if it's worth having a conversation with their biggest donors, I will also do that. It really pays in the long run because they feel like they've had input in the process, and they feel that it's a process that's being guided, so it's not going to go off the rails.
Well, and it makes the organization look more professional.
Yes.
And a lot of nonprofits, just by the nature of being a nonprofit, have a problem that stakeholders don't always engage in as seriously because they think that, well, you're a nonprofit, how hard could it be, right? We know that's not the case. And so being able to look professional is huge.
Yeah. And everybody, you want to assume that everybody who's working with you, your partner organizations, your donors, cares about you as an organization. So if they care about you, they want to be asked questions. They want to be engaged. They don't want to be surprised. They don't want to call 6 months later and say, hey, we just hired so-and-so. Can we bring her over for you to meet?
And then say, you did? What happened to someone? What happened to your last person?
Remember, no surprises.
Right.
No one likes surprises. Whether we're talking about the people who like change or there were people who are driven into shock by change. No one likes surprises. We're talking about engagement. We're talking about informing people. We're talking about getting input from people. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are continuing to honor the incumbent. We are still honoring the chief executive. We're not doing this around them. So Matt asked a question earlier, whether or not it makes sense for the chief executive to be introducing people to the donor, the new hire. Is that what you asked?
Yeah, right.
I think it's a fabulous idea. So I had one of those dream searches. Every once in a while, you have a project that's a dream project. So my dream project was an organization that was very engaged with the community, and the executive director who'd been in her role, I believe, 20 years, prepared for her transition with the staff, with the board, she actually stepped back and allowed the number 2 on the staff to be running the organization day to day. And she sort of stepped to the side. She was available to my staff as we needed her to be, to tell us who the important people were, who we should talk to, but really encouraged her staff and her board to be much more engaged. And then she asked how she should be involved after the transition.
Wow.
So this is important. What we agreed on, she took my guidance, I was very honored, is that she stay physically in the organization for maybe 1 or 2 weeks, physically there with her successor. And then she was no longer physically present, but she was not just available to her successor, but she took her successor and introduced her to all her partners, all the key stakeholders. It was an amazing transition. And then, which I loved, they had an event to honor the outgoing chief executive, introduce the new executive, and all the stakeholders, partners, donors, everybody was there. And it was such a seamless transition.
Well, in putting my fundraising hat on, I would say that was a perfect opportunity to solicit some sort of endowment.
Correct.
Some sort of program to name in this person's honor.
Yes.
So that now people felt like they were doing something important for the organization on the outgoing executive.
On behalf of the outgoing executive.
Exactly. Yeah.
So again, this is a smooth process. Starting this process, we didn't know who would be hired as the successor, but we knew that all the pieces were in place, and people were willing to have really very clear, open conversations about their fears, their concerns, where we were in the process. So there was a lot of transparency. So that's another word I throw around a lot, but this is also an important aspect of this transition. On the fundraising side, transparency.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't tell people what you don't know. You can't give them answers to all the questions, but you can tell them what you have in place. So they have a sense of comfort knowing that it's still an organization that will welcome them as a funder.
And that the mission will continue in whatever form, but that this is a mission-driven organization, not a personality-driven organization.
Oh, God, that's so important.
Yeah, yeah.
And if it has been a personality-driven organization, in this process, the partners and stakeholders will inform us as consultants, and we can work with the search committee and inform them of that.
Right.
So they're very thoughtful about that.